Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 165, Food Safety During the Holidays. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. I am your host and the founder of Real World Nutrition, Shelley, a registered dietitian nutritionist. So, as you listen to this episode, I want to acknowledge I'm recording it the week of Thanksgiving. It is dropping the day after Thanksgiving. Of course, this applies at any time you may hear of it, but maybe a little bit late for some of the information I'm saying, but you can certainly use this information for future holiday meals or any type of meal that you're doing. So, with that, let me get into what I want to talk about today is this topic of food safety. And I talk about this a lot. I actually teach classes for this for various people in the food service industry. But one of the big things that people don't realize is that a lot of times food poisoning or food safety issues are more likely to occur in our personal kitchens rather than when we're eating out at restaurants. And the big thing during the holidays is why this tends to be so crucial or critical, is that we tend to have large meals with large gatherings where food may be sitting out for a bit, or we may be needing to transport food, the leftovers that we may have and how soon we need to use those afterwards, as well as a lot of things happening in the kitchen, especially if you're the one that's in there, that can potentially increase our risk of foodborne illness. So today I want to talk about some of the things of including food storage, so safe food storage, the proper cooking and reheating temperatures. The reheating part is something a lot of people don't pay attention to, as well as some of the issues with cross-contamination and debunking some of these food safety myths that people swear by. All right, so first up, I want to talk about some of the basics of holiday food safety. So, with regard to storage, I'm going to talk about storage first, and then I'm going to get to temperatures, which may seem like reverse order, but more people tend to think about the storage and don't do it as quickly as they should. So when we have a large meal going on and we may be wanting to socialize, we may be wanting to just settle and let food settle and just hang out or do other things, we really do need to pay attention to getting those leftovers taken care of, stored properly, cooled, refrigerated within about 2 hours. So this is so important because sometimes I see people, they will get to the rest of the turkey later. So you carve enough for the meal, but the rest does still need to be dealt with. And I've seen cases where it sits out on the counter for several hours past a safety window. So really need to get that taken care of as soon as possible. Of course, sit down and enjoy the meal and enjoy the company, but also just keep an eye on the time flying by, and hopefully it's not going to go longer than that 2 hours. And I do usually want to sit down and just rest after dinner's done, but I also prefer to have the kitchen cleaned up too. But really, we want to have things in shallow containers if we can, but we want like all the leftovers, not just the turkey, but the mashed potatoes and stuffing and any other vegetables, whatever else you may have. Get those cooled. You don't want them to still be hot when you put them in the fridge, but cool them and get them in the fridge. But first, before you put them in the fridge or even the freezer, I remind people, write down the dates, label them with the dates so you know when it was put in there. Now, right now it may seem obvious, of course, if something's in there on Sunday, you know you had it on Thursday because that was the holiday. But sometimes things get away from us. Again, this is a year-round tip too. And label leftovers. So I had something on my kitchen counter this week and somebody was surprised. Of course, it's November when I'm recording this, but the date on the package said January from earlier this year, and they were surprised. Well, it was because I had put it in the freezer back in January and taken it out earlier this week, so it was perfectly fine. And this was a baked good. So it was something, but the date was on there. I knew exactly what it was and when I had put it in there. And if it had been more than the year, I know 11 months is, it was closer to 10 months, was cutting it close, but I probably would have just put it in the trash. But anyway, get those things stored right away. Now, let me talk about the proper cooking temperatures. So, this is before the storage, obviously, in the prep. But really, turkey and other poultry, like chicken, of course, needs to be cooked or get an internal temperature of 165 degrees. And this is where I always tell people we want to make sure we use a meat thermometer or a thermometer to check the proper temperature. And I don't use those pop-up things that come in a lot of turkeys, the pop-up things that indicate it's done, because I found over the years that is not accurate. It can lead to overcooking. Now, I encourage you to look this up online because, of course, in a podcast, it's hard to explain. But you want to be careful you're using the meat thermometer properly. So I've seen cases recently where people are using the thermometer where they're just sticking the tip of the thermometer into the meat. When really, if you look closely at the meat thermometer, you'll probably see like a little notch in the stem about an inch or two up. That little notch, it's really small, but if you look for it, you can run your finger over the stem. That is the part that needs to be inserted completely into the meat. So you want to make sure it's not going through where that is on the other side and open to air, but get it in the right temperature. And there's optimal places to test the turkey to see that it's at the right temperature. I put the thermometer in multiple locations. So while it's cooking, it stays in one space. But when I take it out, I check in multiple spaces. Now, if you're doing something other than turkey, like beef, pork, or lamb, all of those should be cooked to a minimum of 145 degrees. Now, I want to emphasize this. There is rest time or carryover time. So in any of these meats, whether it's turkey or poultry or red meat, you want to acknowledge there's carryover time or carryover cooking in that rest time. So something may be at a temperature of 160, for example, but once it sits for about 15 minutes to cool, in fact, that is a misnomer. The temperature does increase a bit, so the cooking still happens for a little bit afterwards. And then when we're talking about casseroles and reheated dishes, so things like stuffing, I call it stuffing. I do not put stuffing inside the bird. It's just a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. I don't bother with that because it messes with the cooking. But casseroles, from a green bean casserole to stuffing to any type of casserole that may be made, we want to make sure that goes to 165 degrees. Now, here's the important thing for reheating leftovers. Regardless of what food it is, if it's a food that's been stored cold and needs to be reheated, or we're choosing to reheat it, it needs to be reheated to 165 degrees. And if you're going to do this in the microwave, there can be cold spots and hot spots, so check in multiple places. So that 165 is important. So even if something could have been at a lower temperature when we ate it the first time, leftovers is 165. And I emphasize all these temperatures is the various potential pathogens or bacteria that could be in various foods. The ones that are unique to each type are related to what those temperatures are. So the 165 kills off most of the stuff that could be growing and causing us to get sick. So these are references you can find online, but I've always say the key, leftovers 165, birds 165. And you can do hotter than that, but that means it's more like overcooking and drying food out. All right, now next up, I'm going in reverse order, is preventing cross-contamination. So when I'm talking about cross-contamination, this is truly separating raw and cooked foods. And I know a lot of times this seems obvious, but I still find that a lot of people still don't this. So when we're talking raw foods, this could be raw poultry, dealing with the turkey. I get turkey and chicken. Boy, I swear I have to hose down the entire kitchen because I'm paranoid of stuff being bacteria flying all over the place. But when we're talking about raw foods, then we want to use separate cutting boards and more specifically raw foods that are potentially hazardous. So if we're talking raw vegetables, that's not as concerning. Of course, we want to wash those, but using knives that we've been using, um, turkey or poultry, or if you're using the innards of the turkey for any type of stuffing or gravy, you want to make sure that's used on a plastic cutting board, as well as before that knife is used for anything else. Trade out the knife, wash it, whatever you need to do before going to any type of vegetables that may be uncooked or just cooked lightly. So produce and meats, we really should have separate cutting boards. I never, ever, ever have raw meats on a wooden cutting board. It's always on a plastic one. And there's separate, most of that stuff goes straight into the dishwasher when I'm done. But here's the thing too, wash hands frequently. Way more than you think you need to. Most people don't know this, but before, during, and after handling food. So I use towels, of course, most people do, but I use towels while I'm cooking. I wipe my hands on it while I'm cooking, but I have a completely separate towel that is used for drying my hands after I wash them. So don't go and wash my hands and then dry it on the towel I'm using as a rag, so to speak, while I'm cooking. So there's so much potential for cross-contamination in that sense. Use clean utensils and surfaces. Again, this seems so obvious, but this is after handling raw meat or eggs. So I was asked one time, so let's say we're cooking ground beef and we're using a spatula to use that ground beef while we're cooking it and then go to serve it. Somebody said, well, do I need to switch it out? Well, technically, yes, to reduce the risk of not chronic, but foodborne illness, you would want to serve the meat with a different utensil than what you use to cook it. But of course, you can always wash it. And then just for serving, we want to use obviously clean serving utensils for every dish, but really keep a serving utensil for each type of food. So that's, one for the stuffing, one for the potatoes, one for the vegetables. So we're not crossing over to different things, and this can just cause some more bacteria cross-contamination, and just so many ways of things can get awry on that. All right, so I want to talk about some food safety myths. So with regard to especially leftovers, things when we're going into the fridge and looking at leftovers and if we didn't date it or it's dated, but you're like, well, is this still good? A lot of times say, well, go by the smell. And my rule is if you have to ask somebody, smell this, do you think this smells all right? That's really a sign that you probably should not be eating it. Just because something doesn't smell bad doesn't mean it's not potentially hazardous. So this is why I encourage the dates. Encourage the dates written on every container, whether it's tape, whether it's a label maker, whether it's a dry erase reusable marker. That's a big thing that we want to make sure we have on there. The thing, I don't know if people still do this, but this idea of rinsing or washing a turkey or chicken, one, I don't know. I swear this is a joke. Washing does not mean with soap. Don't be ridiculous on that. But don't ever use soap. But old school thinking was that if you rinsed the turkey or chicken, it would help remove bacteria. But in actuality, it actually spreads more bacteria. I just can't even imagine if we used a black light to look at the sink and around the kitchen, around the sink area, where how much bacteria would be there. So I use a large baking pan, or I have the sink completely cleared out. When I open up the bird from its plastic casing or the wrapping, and make sure that all goes down the drain, but then I clean thoroughly. I also use gloves when I'm dealing with raw turkey or chicken, but don't be washing or rinsing the raw meats there. And then other times, this idea that if you see it steaming, the food is steaming, that it's hot enough and that it's safe. That's not necessarily the case. So always use a thermometer. One of my favorite, absolute essential kitchen tools is an instant read thermometer. Always check with a thermometer. So now let me go back to the start of what I was talking about and talking about safe holiday leftovers. This is the part people look forward to the most. They're so excited about is having the leftovers, or at least in my family, that's a big deal. So I want to talk about some of the storage time frames. So here I tend to say the rule of 4. So this is to help people remember, even though there's some fluidity here. So the storage time frame, if we put those things in the fridge in a timely manner, we want to eat those leftovers within 3 to 4 days from the refrigerated type. So Thursday afternoon after Thanksgiving, we put the stuff in the fridge. That means by Monday, if you still have food left over, you need to eat it or toss it. And make sure things are separated when you're putting things in the storage. But again, this is why dates are important. Now, if you're not going to be able to eat all those leftovers, and you know you probably won't be able to eat all those leftovers, on that same day, Thursday, you want to put stuff in the freezer. So don't put things in the fridge for 3 to 4 days and then say, oh, well, I'll put it in the freezer, because the time is already gone by. So foods in the freezer, again, label, date them. And most foods can be safely frozen 2 to 6 months. That's where I say that rule of 4. So 4 months, that's an average there. Quality will decrease over time. And as I mentioned, I had a baked good that I had in the freezer for 10 months. And really, the reason it was in there that long is it fell to the bottom of the freezer and it got lost among other things. And I didn't find it until I was cleaning out the freezer. But what is really important is use the airtight containers, use freezer bags as much as possible. So the safety won't be poor after 6 months, just the quality will be less. You might have freezer burn and things like that. But again, freeze that stuff same day as soon as possible. And then the danger zone. So here's another group of 4s. So between the temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, that's where bacteria is growing the fastest. That's where I say bacteria is having an orgy and just proliferating like crazy. So as much as possible, keep food out of this temperature range. Obviously, things are going to happen. It's going to happen. But the less time we have it in that range, the better. So if you're traveling to family's house or friend's house for the holidays, hopefully you're not traveling too far. So let's talk about this. If I'm making something that's hot, luckily I'm going to a family member's house across town or less than an hour away. That used to occur. I've got to find a way to keep that hot. And so those thermal bags can be used for both hot or cold. A lot of people tend to think it's just for cold, but it can be, hot dishes can be put in there too. But you want to try to get that transported as quickly as possible. Keep it hot as best as you can. Same with cold foods. Try to keep it below the 40 as much as possible until it's time to serve. So that's just some things. The transporting can be the harder thing, especially if you're going long distances. I had family that lives 5-6 hours away, depending on who's driving. So they brought the ingredients for the foods they want to make that are contributing for the holidays, rather than preparing it and worrying about the storage and all that prior to that. So I know that was a lot of separate things with regard to food safety, food storage, as it relates to holidays. Again, this can be a year round thing, absolutely, positively. But really, the big thing is we really don't want to be sick for the holidays. We don't want to get other people sick following meals at our homes and that sort of thing, or getting sick because the food wasn't transported properly. So it's really protecting the health. I hate food waste. I hate throwing away food. But at the same time, if that food is still in there on the fifth day, I am not going to risk my health or my comfort by risking getting sick a couple days after eating that. So, really, I'm not going through all the different types of foodborne illness, just we want to reduce the risk of that so much, especially if we have children or older adults in our family, or any of our family members are immunocompromised. All right, so with all of that, I know this is out after Thanksgiving, but be mindful of those different dates, times, and temperatures moving forward. And if you still have those Thanksgiving leftovers in the fridge by Monday, eat it or get it out. All right, everyone, that is it for this week's episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. I thank you so much for listening. I encourage you to share this episode, or at least information in this episode, with friends or family to spread awareness, and follow or follow whatever the terminology is today, the podcast, or where you check where you get your download every single week, every Friday. And if you would be so kind as to leave a positive review on things you learn from the Real World Nutrition Podcast, I would appreciate it so much. All right, everyone. Well, happy holidays, and until next week, take care and bye for now.